So I was driving along when I saw Tricky, Mrs. Pumphrey's pet dog, on the road. And let me tell you, I was shocked. Tricky looked like a bloated sausage, all fat and red-eyed. Mrs. Pumphrey explained that she thought he was malnourished, so she fed him malt, cod liver oil, and even Horlicks at night. But here's the thing, she said she didn't give him much to eat. I asked if she cut down on his sweets, but she couldn't resist giving him cakes and chocolates. And then it hit me, Tricky was just too greedy. He didn't know how to say no to food, even when his stomach was full. I couldn't help but wonder what else Mrs. Pumphrey was feeding him. And when I asked about exercise, she said she took him for walks occasionally, but his favorite ring-throwing exercise was on hold because the gardener had a bad back. Poor Tricky, he needed some discipline and a proper diet. But hey, at least now we know what's going on. Let's hope we can help him get back in shape. So there I was, trying to convince Mrs. Pumphrey that her beloved Tricky needed a serious change in his food habits. I warned her that if she didn't control his eating and increase his exercise, he would fall ill. And guess what? My prediction came true. Tricky started refusing food, vomiting, and just seemed so lethargic. As a vet, I knew the only solution was to get him out of the house and into the hospital for observation. Mrs. Pumphrey was devastated, but I had to be firm. Tricky's health was at stake. So, I wrapped him up in a blanket and took him away, despite her tears. It was a tough decision, but sometimes tough love is necessary. Stay tuned to find out what happens next.
So, I recently had this amazing experience with a dog named Tricky. Let me tell you, this little guy lived the grandest life. But when it came time to move all his stuff, it was quite a challenge. I mean, his daybed, night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, snack bowl, you name it, he had it. And let me tell you, it was a struggle fitting all of that in my car. But hey, we managed. As we were leaving, Mrs. Pumphrey threw in a bunch of coats that Tricky used to wear. And you know what? When I looked back in the rear mirror, everyone was crying. It was such an emotional moment. But you know what? Tricky, this little helpless animal, wagged his tail. It was like he knew everything was going to be okay. When we reached the hospital, all the other dogs gathered around the doctor. But Tricky, poor thing, couldn't even move. The other dogs sniffed him and thought he was uninteresting. But you know what? That didn't stop Tricky from getting better. After a couple of days, Tricky was up and about, exploring the place. And when I opened the door, he quickly joined the other dogs in the garden. It was such a heartwarming sight. And let me tell you, dinner time with all the dogs was quite a scene. They were eating so fast, afraid that another dog would come and steal their food. It was like a race. So yeah, that's the story of Tricky, the lucky dog who had a grand life and found his way to recovery. It just goes to show that even when things seem tough, there's always a way to make it better. Mrs. Pumphrey, his owner, started sending brandy for him during his recovery. Can you believe it? I couldn't at first. But then, something unexpected happened. Mr. Ario, the vet, couldn't resist the temptation and started enjoying some of that brandy himself. Extra eggs, wine in the afternoon, and brandy in the evening. Talk about a treat. But here's the thing, Mr. Ario wanted Tricky to stay with him forever. He fell in love with the little guy. But he realized that Mrs. Pumphrey, who loved Tricky like a mother, was suffering. So, after 15 days, Tricky was ready to go home. Mrs. Pumphrey arrived in a fancy car, nervous and excited. And guess what? Tricky had made an incredible recovery. He was healthy, playing with other dogs, and looking so muscular. When Tricky saw Mrs. Pumphrey, he couldn't contain his joy. He jumped into her lap, licking her face and barking in excitement. It was a beautiful moment. As Mrs. Pumphrey left, she thanked Mr. Ario with tears of joy, saying it was a triumph of surgery. And you know what? She was right. The treatment was a success. Such a heartwarming story, right?